The last good night of Brennan Holt's life ended with a kiss on Maren Collier's forehead and the quiet belief that she'd still be there when he opened his eyes. He remembers the weight of her head against his chest. He remembers the sound of her breathing, slow, steady, safe. He fell asleep that night the way a man falls asleep when he believes the hardest part is behind him. He was wrong. The last night Maren Collier spent in that apartment, she pressed her lips to a sleeping man's forehead and whispered goodbye to someone who would never understand why she had to leave. She remembers the way his arm tightened around her waist. Even unconscious, even in sleep, he held on. She had to peel his fingers back one at a time, carefully, the way you remove something fragile from a place it was never supposed to stay. She didn't look back when she closed the door, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that if she turned around, she'd never make it to the car. Same night, same apartment, same kiss pressed to the same skin at the same hour. He woke up to an empty bed and spent 3 years trying to understand why. She drove through the dark with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against her stomach, carrying a secret that would grow into a person with his jawline, his gray eyes, and his name nowhere on the birth certificate. One of these people is telling you the truth. The other one is telling themselves a story they needed to survive. And right now, you think you already know which one is which. You don't. Before this story is over, you're going to pick a side. You're going to be certain you're right. And then the story is going to flip, and you're going to feel the ground shift under everything you thought you knew. So go ahead, subscribe now, and tell me in the comments whose side you're on. Because by the end, most of you will have changed your answer. Brennan Holt learned how to love by watching a man who did it badly. His father, Gerald Holt, was the kind of parent who showed up to every school play 15 minutes late and left before the curtain call. He coached Little League one season, not because he wanted to, but because Brennan's mother had signed him up without asking, and Gerald treated the obligation the way a prisoner treats a work detail. He stood on the sideline with his arms folded and his jaw set, counting the innings like a man counting down the days to his release. Gerald never hit anyone, never drank, never disappeared for weeks at a time the way some fathers did. He was present in the most technical sense of the word, a body in a chair at the dinner table, a signature on permission slips, a car in the driveway, every single night. But presence without warmth is just surveillance. And Brennan grew up under the watch of a man who fulfilled every duty of fatherhood without once making it look like something he'd chosen. His mother filled the gaps. She filled them with noise and warmth and overcorrection, laughing too loud, hugging too long, saying "I love you" at the end of every phone call as though she were compensating for a deficit only she could measure. Brennan loved her for it. But he also absorbed the lesson underneath. Love, when done badly, is a burden you hand to the people closest to you and ask them to carry without complaint. So Brennan carried it quietly. He became a man who felt everything at full volume and expressed it at a whisper. He built a successful contracting business with his partner Dominic, not because he chased ambition, but because building things with his hands was the one language that didn't require translation. Wood didn't need him to explain himself. Concrete didn't misread his silence. A finished structure stood as evidence of care whether he said the words or not. And then Maren Collier walked into his life like a locksmith, not picking the lock, not forcing it, but sitting down beside the door and talking to it until it opened on its own. She was the first person who didn't need him to narrate what he was feeling. She read it. She read it the way some people read weather, subtle shifts in pressure, changes in temperature that most people wouldn't notice until the wind was already blowing. She knew he was upset before he did. She knew he was happy by the way he stood in the kitchen, not by anything he said. She teased him about it, gently, always gently, and the teasing made the silence feel like a shared language instead of a wall. "You love me like a man defusing a bomb," she told him once, her bare feet tucked under his thigh on the couch, some documentary about deep-sea creatures playing on the television neither of them was watching. Very carefully, very seriously, like one wrong move and the whole thing detonates. He kissed the top of her head and said nothing, because she was right, and because being known that precisely by another human being was the closest thing to freedom he'd ever felt. They were together 14 months when the Tuesday happened. She came home from her sister's baby shower, carrying a small yellow gift bag she'd forgotten to leave behind. Something in her face was open in a way it usually wasn't, unguarded, almost hopeful, like a window left unlocked on purpose. She set the bag on the kitchen counter and looked at him with an expression that was half question, half dare. "Do you ever think about it? Kids, a family, any of that?" And Brennan, who had spent 28 years watching his father serve a sentence called parenthood, reached into the most honest part of himself, and pulled out the only answer that wasn't a lie. I think about whether I'd be any good at it, and I don't have an answer I trust. He watched her nod. Slowly. He watched the openness in her face close, not like a slam, but like a door easing shut on well-oiled hinges, so quiet you almost miss the click. She picked up the yellow bag, carried it to the bedroom, and didn't mention it again. In Brennan's mind, that moment was a beginning. He had shown her the rawest thing inside him, the fear that he'd inherited more than his father's jawline, and he was waiting for her to meet him there, to say, "We'll figure it out together." To sit with the uncertainty the way she sat with everything else about him, patiently, fluently, without rushing him toward a conclusion he wasn't ready to reach. He waited 6 weeks for that conversation to continue. Instead, he woke up to an apartment so empty it echoed. No note on the counter, no message on his phone, no fight he could replay to locate the fracture. Just absence, clean, total, surgical, the closet half bare, the bathroom shelf cleared of everything except his own razor and a bottle of cologne she'd bought him for his birthday. The ceramic mug she'd found at a flea market still sitting in the dish rack, water spotted and abandoned, the only proof she hadn't been a dream he'd been having for 14 months. He called her 17 times that first night. Each call rang into silence, not voicemail, not a disconnection tone, just silence, as though the number had been hollowed out from the inside. He drove to her sister's house at 11 o'clock on a work night and stood on the porch in clothes he'd been wearing since morning. Her sister opened the door with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this visit and dreading it in equal measure. "She asked me not to say where she went," her sister said. "She asked me to tell you she left by choice. That's all I can give you, Brennan." The way she said it, firm, rehearsed, guilty, told him everything he needed to know about the planning that had gone into this. Maren hadn't panicked. She hadn't fled in the middle of the night on impulse. She had prepared. She had packed. She had briefed her sister like a witness preparing for cross-examination. He filed a missing persons report the next morning. The officer behind the desk listened politely, typed something into a computer, and told Brennan what the law already knew: a woman who leaves by choice is not missing. She's just gone. So Brennan did what he had always done with pain that had no target and no instructions. He held still. He went to work. He built things with his hands and dismantled nothing with his mouth. He kept paying for the phone plan she'd abandoned, $47 a month for a number that rang into nothing, because canceling it felt like agreeing she was never coming back. He kept her mug in the dish rack. He kept the indent in the couch cushion where she used to sit and avoided that side of the sofa the way a man avoids a grave he hasn't accepted as real. People told him to move on. His mother said it with her hand on his cheek and her voice soft enough to bruise. "Sweetheart, she made her decision." His partner Dominic said it over beers with the bluntness of a man who had never confused patience with self-destruction. "Brother, you're haunting your own apartment. She's not coming back." A woman named Claire agreed to dinner 3 times before she stopped agreeing. On the 3rd date, she put her coat on before the check arrived and looked at him with something that wasn't anger, but was close. "You're not here, Brennan. You're with whoever she was, and I don't compete with ghosts." She was right. He wasn't there. He was standing in the doorway of an empty apartment, staring at a ceramic mug, trying to solve a crime that had no evidence, no witnesses, and no motive he could name. Brennan Holt was not a man who said the right things, but he had said an honest thing, the most honest thing he knew, and the woman he loved had vanished because of it. At least, that's the story he told himself, and he believed every word. Now stop, rewind, go back to that same apartment, that same Tuesday, that same conversation, but sit in a different chair. Because Maren Collier heard something that night that Brennan Holt never said, and she spent the next 3 years building an entire life on top of it. To understand what Maren heard, you have to understand what she was trained to listen for. Her mother, Maren Collier, was a woman who expressed love exclusively through logistics. Lunches packed the night before with the crusts removed because Maren once mentioned she didn't like them, but no note inside, no "I love you" scribbled on a napkin, nothing that required the vulnerability of language. School uniforms ironed with military precision. Alarm clocks set 15 minutes early so no one in the house ever had to rush. Every act of care filtered through function, stripped of feeling, delivered like a service rather than a choice. Vivian never said the words. Not once. Not at graduation, when Maren crossed the stage and looked into the audience and found her mother clapping with a face that could have belonged to a stranger watching someone else's daughter. Not at the hospital, when Maren's appendix ruptured at 15, and Vivian drove 90 miles an hour to the emergency room but sat in the recovery chair afterward, reading a magazine like she was waiting for an oil change. And not the night Maren came home at 19 with bruises on her arm from a boyfriend named Ryan who had mistaken control for closeness. Maren walked through the front door shaking, not crying, because Vivian's house was not a house where crying produced results, and stood in the kitchen holding her own wrist like it belonged to someone else. Her mother looked at the bruise, opened the freezer, handed Maren an ice pack wrapped in a dishcloth. "You'll know better next time," Vivian said. And that was it. That was the entire conversation. No follow-up, no fury. No. "I will drive to that boy's house and end him." Just a cold compress and a lesson dressed as advice. You should have seen it coming, and now that you have, adjust. Maren adjusted. She adjusted so thoroughly that it became her operating system. She learned to read what people meant by what they refused to say. She became an expert in the architecture of avoidance, the pause that hides a lie, the joke that redirects a feeling, the answer that sounds complete but leaves the real question sealed shut in a room nobody's allowed to enter. She didn't resent her mother for this. That's the part most people wouldn't understand. She was grateful. Because the world is full of people who will tell you what they think you want to hear, and Maren's mother, by never telling her anything at all, had given her the ability to hear what was actually being said underneath the performance. It was a gift. It was also a weapon, and she didn't always know the difference. So when Brennan Holt sat in that kitchen on a Tuesday night and said, "I think about whether I'd be any good at it, and I don't have an answer I trust," Maren did what she had done every day since she was old enough to read silence. She translated. She didn't hear a man being vulnerable. She heard a man being precise. She heard someone who had already done the calculations and arrived at an answer he was too kind to deliver directly. She heard, "I've thought about this. The answer is no. But I love you enough to frame it as uncertainty so you don't feel rejected." She heard her mother handing her an ice pack. She heard a careful man choosing caution over her, not because he was cruel, but because careful people don't choose the thing that scares them. They choose the explanation that lets them stay exactly where they are. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, Maren had already begun composing the goodbye she would never actually write. 2 weeks later, she sat on the bathroom floor of their apartment at 6 in the morning. The tile was cold against her legs. A pregnancy test balanced on the edge of the sink, and her hand pressed flat against her stomach, not in wonder, not yet, but in calculation. The same kind of calculation her mother would have made. The same cold arithmetic of what comes next when the person beside you has already told you, in every language except the direct one, that they are not built for what you need. The test confirmed what her body had already been whispering for days. And Maren made a decision that felt, in that moment, like the bravest thing she had ever done. She would not tell Brennan Holt he was going to be a father. She would not sit across from him and watch him do the math, love for her on one side of the equation, fear of becoming his own father on the other, and arrive at an answer shaped like obligation wearing the mask of choice. She would not hand a child to a man who would stay out of guilt and leave in increments the way Gerald Holt had, present but absent, fulfilling the duties while resenting every one. She would not become her mother, Vivian, who stayed in a loveless marriage for 19 years because leaving felt selfish, and who paid for that loyalty with a face that forgot how to soften, and a daughter who learned that love was something you survived rather than something you enjoyed. Maren would leave. She would leave before the staying became a trap for both of them. She would carry this child into a life she built with her own hands, in a place where no one would ask her to translate a man's silence into a promise he never intended to make. She found a nursing job in a small coastal town in Oregon through an online job board, affordable enough to manage alone, far enough that Brennan wouldn't stumble across her accidentally. Her sister, Jocelyn, helped her pack the apartment in a single weekend while Brennan was at a work conference in Denver. They moved fast. They moved quiet. Maren changed her phone number, wiped her forwarding address from every record she could reach, and asked Jocelyn to deliver one message, and one message only. She left by choice. Don't follow. Standing in the doorway of the empty apartment for the last time, Maren saw the ceramic mug she'd bought at a flea market still sitting in the dish rack. She almost grabbed it. Her hand actually reached for it. But taking it felt like carrying a piece of him into the new life, and the whole point of the new life was that it would be hers, clean, complete, uncomplicated by the grammar of a man who said one thing and meant something she couldn't afford to keep decoding. She left the mug. She closed the door. She drove through the dark with one hand on the wheel, and the other resting on a stomach that didn't show yet, but already felt like the heaviest thing she'd ever carried. And she told herself, the first of 1,000 times, that she was doing the right thing, that this was not running, that this was mercy. Now you've heard both sides. You've heard his version, the man who said an honest thing and woke up to an empty apartment and spent 3 years bleeding from a wound he couldn't name. And you've heard hers, the woman who translated that honesty into a verdict, because every lesson she'd ever learned taught her that what people withhold matters more than what they offer. She didn't just leave a man. She left carrying his child, and she never gave him the chance to know. So now I need to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. His side or her side? Who do you believe? Who do you defend? Because we are nowhere close to finished, and the ground you're standing on right now is about to shift. 3 years is a long time to hold your breath. Brennan didn't fall apart. That would have been easier. A clean collapse, a visible breaking, something people could point to and say, he needs help. Instead, he did something worse. He kept functioning. He showed up to job sites at 6 in the morning and swung hammers until the ache in his arms drowned out the ache in his chest. He ate meals that tasted like obligation. He slept in a bed that was too wide on one side and woke up every morning with his arms stretched across the empty half, reaching for a body that hadn't been there in over 1,000 days. From the outside, Brennan Holt looked like a man who had moved on. He'd expanded the business with Dominic, 2 new commercial contracts, a small crew that respected him because he worked harder than anyone he employed. He bought a house. Not an apartment, not a rental. A house with a yard he didn't need and a second bedroom he never furnished. He told himself the second bedroom was for storage. He told himself a lot of things, but the truth lived in the details no one else noticed. He measured every room he entered by whether Maren would have liked it. Every restaurant, would she have ordered the fish or the pasta? Every street corner, would she have wanted to walk left or right? Every silence in every conversation, would she have known what to say here even though he didn't? Every woman he met wore the wrong face. Not because they weren't attractive or kind or interesting, some of them were all three, but because they occupied space that his mind had already allocated. The shape Maren left behind wasn't a gap, it was a mold, and no one else fit inside it, no matter how hard he tried to stop comparing. His mother stopped bringing it up after the 2nd year. She'd said her piece, gently, carefully, with all the warmth Gerald Holt had never contributed to the household, and when Brennan didn't change, she did what loving parents eventually learn to do. She stepped back and watched and kept her grief for her son private. Dominic lasted longer. He'd drop Maren's name into conversation like a grenade with a slow fuse, testing whether Brennan would flinch. You ever hear from her? At a job site. You still paying that phone bill? Over lunch. Brennan answered the same way every time. A shake of the head, a subject change, a silence that dared Dominic to push further. Dominic never did. Even blunt men recognize a wall they can't hammer through. The problem wasn't heartbreak. Brennan could have survived heartbreak. Heartbreak has a narrative. You loved, you lost, you grieve, you rebuild. The problem was the question mark. He didn't know what he'd done. He couldn't locate the moment where the story broke. Couldn't identify the word or the action or the failure that made Maren Collier decide he was something to escape from. And a man who can't name the wound can't close it. He just walks around bleeding in a way that doesn't show, calling it strength because he doesn't have a better word. 3 years into that unnamed bleeding, Brennan drove to Portland for a materials supplier meeting, 600 miles from the apartment where his life had been one thing and became another. He stopped at a grocery store on the way back. He needed coffee and didn't want to wait until the next exit. He was in the cereal aisle when he saw her. Maren, standing 20 feet away with a boy on her hip, a boy who looked about 3, with dark hair and a jawline that didn't belong to a stranger. The boy was laughing at something Maren had whispered to him, and she was laughing back, and the two of them together looked like the final page of a book someone had ripped from his hands before he'd finished reading it. His chest didn't tighten. It collapsed, not because the child looked like him, though the resemblance hit him like a physical blow, but because Maren was smiling the way she used to smile at him, easy, unguarded, complete. She had taken that smile and given it to someone else, someone small, someone who had Brennan's face and didn't know his name. He didn't approach. His legs wouldn't move, and even if they had, his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating with a clarity that grief had never allowed him. If he walked up to her now, emotional, shaking, ambushed by a truth this enormous, he would say the wrong thing. He would demand answers in a voice too loud for a grocery store. He would scare the boy. So he stood behind a display of canned tomatoes, with his hands trembling against the handle of a shopping cart he'd already forgotten, and he watched them walk to the register. He watched Maren pay. He watched her carry the boy to a car in the parking lot, a silver hatchback, practical, the kind of car a woman buys when she's building a life designed for two. He memorized a license plate. He said each number and letter under his breath until it was carved into his memory the way her absence was carved into his daily life, permanent, specific, impossible to misplace. Brennan Holt had spent 3 years holding still because moving forward meant accepting she was gone. But she wasn't gone. She was 600 miles away, living in a town he'd never heard of, raising a child who had his jaw and his eyes and no idea he existed. He walked out of that grocery store a different man than the one who'd walked in. The holding still was over. The unnamed wound finally had a shape, and the shape was a boy. 3 years old, laughing in a cereal aisle, completely unaware that his father had just found him behind a wall of canned tomatoes. Brennan got in his truck. He sat in the parking lot for a long time, and when he finally pulled onto the highway, he wasn't driving toward home. He was driving toward an answer, and he had no intention of letting go. Maren built her new life the way you build a house on ground that shifts, with flexible joints and deep foundations and the constant awareness that nothing she constructed would ever be fully still. The town was called Crestwood. It sat on the Oregon coast like an afterthought, a handful of streets, a post office, 2 restaurants that closed by 9, and a community clinic that needed night shift nurses badly enough to hire a woman who was 5 months pregnant and asked no questions about where she'd come from. Maren took the job, signed a lease on a cottage 3 blocks from the water, and began the slow, deliberate work of becoming someone who didn't need Brennan Holt. She painted the nursery green, a deep, quiet green, the exact shade of a jacket Brennan used to wear on cold mornings, the one with the frayed cuffs he refused to replace because it was the first thing he'd ever bought with money he earned himself. She didn't realize she'd chosen his color until the second coat was already on the wall, and she stood back and felt him standing in the room like a ghost she'd invited without meaning to. She repainted it blue that same week, a clean, neutral blue that belonged to no one. Nico arrived on a Tuesday, because of course it was a Tuesday, because the most important moments of Maren's life had apparently signed an agreement to land on the same day of the week. He was small and furious and perfect. He screamed for the first 40 minutes of his life with a commitment that the delivery nurse called impressive and Maren called inherited. And when he finally stopped screaming and opened his eyes for the first time, Maren saw Brennan's exact shade of gray staring up at her, patient, serious, unmistakable, and she wept, not from sadness, from the sheer, crushing weight of carrying a secret that was also a person who would grow to look like the man she'd left, a person who would someday ask questions she hadn't figured out how to answer. But that was a future problem, and Maren Collier was a woman who solved present problems and filed future ones in a drawer she promised herself she'd open later. So, she built. She worked night shifts and slept in fragments and learned to nurse and soothe and function on a level of exhaustion that would have broken her in any previous life. She made friends slowly, other nurses, a neighbor named Denise who watched Nico on Wednesday evenings without being asked, a librarian who recommended picture books and never pried. She built a community the way she'd built everything since leaving, carefully, selectively, with enough warmth to sustain but not enough closeness to threaten. For 2 years, it worked. The locked door held. The life she'd constructed felt solid, earned, safe. Then Nico turned 3, and the door started rattling. It began without words. At the park, Maren would set Nico down near the swings and watch him play, but she noticed his eyes drifting, not toward the other children, toward the men. He tracked every father who walked through the gate the way a compass tracks north, silently, automatically, pulled by a force he couldn't name and she couldn't explain. He watched fathers push swings. He watched fathers kneel to wipe dirty faces. He watched fathers lift children onto their shoulders, and his gaze would stay fixed on those shoulders long after the pair had walked away. Then the words came, delivered one evening over a plate of cut-up chicken and applesauce, with all the blunt, undecorated honesty of a child who had not yet learned that some questions carry weight. "Mama, where's my daddy?" Maren's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down. She looked at her son, this boy with Brennan's gray eyes and Brennan's direct stare and Brennan's absolute refusal to leave a question unfinished, and she felt something crack in the foundation she'd spent 3 years laying. "It's just us, baby," she said. "You and me. And that's enough." Nico accepted this the way children accept weather, without argument but without satisfaction. He went back to his applesauce. He didn't ask again that night, but he asked again the next week, and the week after that, and each time the question arrived with a little more weight, a little more awareness, a little more of the quiet, persistent precision that Maren recognized because she had fallen in love with it once in a man who said honest things and meant them more deeply than his words could carry. The wound she had crossed state lines to prevent, a child burdened by an unwilling father, had not materialized. In its place, a different wound had grown, the wound of absence, quieter than rejection, less dramatic, no bruises to show, no villain to blame, just a blank space where a person should have been, and a boy who sensed the blank space the way children sense everything adults think they've hidden, completely, instinctively, without mercy. Maren told herself every night, after Nico was asleep and the cottage was quiet and the sound of the ocean through the window was supposed to feel like peace, but increasingly felt like repetition, that she had made the right choice. But the truth, the one she kept locked in the same room where she stored the green paint she'd covered over and the phone number she'd memorized but never dialed, was simpler than any story she'd built around it. She had never given Brennan the chance to choose. She had listened to his silence, translated it into a verdict, and delivered the sentence without a trial. She had decided what he would have done and then punished him for the version of events that existed only inside her own interpretation, and the locked room she'd built to protect her son was starting to feel less like a shelter and more like a sentence of its own. Both of them, Brennan in his too-wide bed, Maren in her blue-painted cottage, had arrived at the same place from opposite directions. Something essential had been lost, not because someone lied, not because someone was cruel, but because a single conversation was left unfinished, and two people who loved each other built entire lives on top of the silence that remained. Now, right now, I need you to do something. Share this video with your partner, your best friend, your sister, your brother, whoever sits closest to your heart. Share it and ask them one question: whose side are you on? Because I promise you, I guarantee you, you will not agree. And that disagreement? That's the whole point. Because the lesson in this story doesn't live in being right. It lives in what happens when two people are both right and both wrong at the same time. Stay with me. Because what happens when these two finally collide will change how you hear every word that came before it. Brennan called in a favor he had no right to ask for. His friend Marcus worked for a fleet management company, the kind of job that came with access to databases most civilians didn't know existed. Brennan had helped Marcus renovate his kitchen 2 years ago, free of charge, during a stretch when Marcus was going through a divorce and couldn't afford a contractor. It was the kind of favor that sits in the ledger between men, unspoken and uncollected, until someone needs something badly enough to cash it in. Brennan cashed it in with a license plate number and a sentence he delivered with more calm than he felt. "I need an address. Don't ask me why." Marcus hesitated. Brennan could hear it in the pause, the professional risk, the legal gray area, the question of whether helping a friend find a woman who clearly didn't want to be found made him an accomplice or a friend. "This isn't something I should be doing," Marcus said. "I know." The address arrived in a text message 40 minutes later. Crestwood, Oregon, a town Brennan had never heard of, in a part of the coast he'd never visited, as far from their old apartment as a person could get without crossing an ocean. He drove through the night. 8 hours on highways that narrowed into 2-lane roads that narrowed into a single main street that ended at a stretch of shoreline where the houses were small and spaced apart like teeth in an old comb. He found the address just after dawn, a white cottage with a blue front door, a fence that needed mending on the left side, and a tricycle tipped on its side in the grass like a child had abandoned it mid-ride and never looked back. Brennan parked across the street and turned off the engine. He sat there for 45 minutes. He didn't knock. He didn't get out of the truck. He just sat with his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, staring at that blue door the way a man stares at a locked safe when he knows what's inside but isn't sure he can survive the opening. 3 years of silence. 3 years of an unanswered question. And the answer was behind a door he could reach in 15 steps. He drove back to his motel. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. 4 days. 4 mornings parked across the street from that white cottage, learning the rhythms of a life he'd been excluded from. Day 1, he watched Maren carry Nico from the car to the front door. The boy balanced on her hip with the ease of long practice, his arms wrapped around her neck, his face buried in her shoulder. She moved differently than Brennan remembered. The Maren he'd known had always carried a low hum of urgency, walking fast, thinking faster, always half a step ahead of the present moment. This Maren was slower, more grounded. She moved with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had taught herself to be enough for two people and had mostly succeeded. Day 2, he watched her kneel on the front step to tie Nico's shoe. The boy stood patiently, one hand resting on the top of her head for balance, and said something that made her laugh. A real laugh, open and unguarded, the kind Brennan used to work for hours to earn. Day 3, he watched Nico chase a cat across the yard with the reckless commitment of a child who believes all animals want to be friends. Maren stood on the porch with a coffee mug, not the flea market mug, a different one, and watched him with an expression Brennan recognized. It was the same expression she used to wear when she looked at Brennan and thought he couldn't see her, a mixture of love and worry and the quiet, fierce arithmetic of someone calculating how long she could keep this good thing safe. Day 4, Brennan woke up in his motel room and knew that if he sat in that truck one more morning without moving, he would sit there forever. Surveillance would become routine. Routine would become cowardice. And he had not driven 8 hours through the night to become a man who watched his own son from across the street like a stranger with no claim. He drove to the cottage. He parked. He got out of the truck, crossed the street, walked up the short path through the yard, past the tipped tricycle, past a pair of small rubber boots left by the door, and he knocked. 2 knocks. Firm. Not aggressive, but not tentative either. The knock of a man who had rehearsed nothing and prepared for everything. The door opened. Maren stood in the frame with Nico on her hip. The boy was wearing a striped shirt and holding a piece of toast with one bite missing. Maren's hair was pulled back. No makeup. A dish towel over one shoulder. She looked like a woman in the middle of a Tuesday morning. Ordinary, settled, complete. Then she saw him. Her face went through every emotion a human being can experience, compressed into the space between 2 heartbeats. Shock first, pure, physical, like a hand pressed to a hot surface. Then fear. Her arm tightened around Nico, pulling him closer the way you pull something precious toward your body when you feel the ground shift. Then grief, fast, flickering, the kind that arrives when something you buried a long time ago claws its way back to the surface. Then relief. And she hated herself for it. Brennan could see that. Could see her fighting the relief like a woman fighting a current she knows will carry her somewhere she swore she'd never go again. Then anger. Steady, justified, righteous anger. Because he had found her. He had done the thing she'd spent 3 years making impossible. And he was standing on her porch like the past could just walk up to your front door and knock. And underneath all of it, underneath the shock and the fear and the grief and the relief and the anger, something else. Something that had survived 3 years of silence and distance and deliberate forgetting. Something stubborn and stupid and completely unextinguished. Brennan, she said, just his name, spoken the way you confirm a fact you already know but need to hear yourself say out loud to believe. He looked at her. Then he looked at the boy on her hip. Gray eyes. His gray eyes. Staring at Brennan with a calm, open curiosity that carried no fear, no suspicion, no history. Just the pure, unburdened attention of a child meeting a stranger who doesn't feel entirely strange. He's mine, Brennan said. Not a question, not an accusation, a statement delivered with the steady voice of a man who had spent 3 years not knowing, and now knew, and would not pretend otherwise to make this easier for anyone. Maren's arm tightened around Nico. Her chin lifted, just slightly, just enough to signal that whatever was about to happen, she would face it standing. The boy looked at Brennan. He held out the piece of toast, offering it the way children offer things, without calculation, without agenda, with the absolute confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned that the world doesn't always want what you're giving. Hi, Nico said. Brennan felt something break open in his chest, not a collapse, not a fracture, but a door swinging wide that had been locked from the inside for 3 years. His vision blurred, his throat tightened, and when he spoke, his voice cracked on the second word in a way he made no effort to hide. Hi, buddy. Nico smiled. He pulled the toast back and took another bite, still watching Brennan with those steady gray eyes, still perfectly calm, still completely unaware that the man standing on his porch had just found the missing half of his own heartbeat standing 3 feet away in a striped shirt, holding breakfast. Maren had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times. In the shower at 2 a.m. after a night shift, when the hot water loosened the muscles in her neck and her mind drifted to the places she normally kept fenced off. In bed, staring at the ceiling, running the conversation like a script she was memorizing for a performance she hoped would never come. In the car, waiting for Nico to fall asleep in the back seat, her lips moving silently around sentences she'd polished until they sounded unbreakable. In every rehearsal she was composed, measured, articulate. She explained her reasons the way a doctor explains a diagnosis, clearly, thoroughly, without apology. She told Brennan what she'd heard that night. She told him why she left. She told him about Nico with steady hands and a voice that didn't waver. And Brennan listened, and he either understood or he didn't, and either way, the boundary held. The walls stayed up. The locked room stayed locked. In every rehearsal, she was in control. Reality was nothing like the rehearsal. Reality was standing in her own doorway in a shirt with applesauce on the collar, holding a 3-year-old who was calmly eating toast, staring at the only man she'd ever loved and feeling. Every wall she'd spent 3 years constructing shift on its foundation like the ground beneath her, had decided without warning to remember that it was never as solid as she'd pretended. Brennan stood on her porch. He looked thinner than she remembered, older around the eyes. His hands were at his sides, not clenched, not reaching, just there, and something about the stillness of them told her he was holding himself together with the same kind of discipline she was. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a man who knew that the next 60 seconds would determine everything and had decided to let her set the terms. "No," Maren said. Then, because the word felt too sharp and too final and not at all what she meant. "Not yet. I need Brennan, I need you to understand something first. You left because you were pregnant." It wasn't a guess. She could see it in his face. The math had been done. The boy's age, the timeline, the 6 weeks between the conversation and her disappearance. Brennan Holt was not a man who missed details. He was a man who held them quietly until they assembled into something he could no longer ignore. "I left because you told me you didn't know if you could do this," Maren said. Her voice was steady. Barely. The rehearsed version of this sentence had been flawless. The real version came out with a hairline fracture running through the center of it. His face changed. She watched it happen, watched him reach back through 3 years of confusion and grief and sleepless nights in an apartment he couldn't bring himself to rearrange. And she watched him locate the exact conversation she was referencing. The Tuesday, the yellow bag, the question she'd asked with her whole heart sitting on the kitchen counter between them. She watched him find the sentence. She watched him hold it up against the meaning she'd given it. And she saw the moment, precise, visible, devastating, when he understood what she had heard versus what he had said. "That's not what I said, Maren. It's what I heard." He took a breath, not a sigh, a breath, deliberate, the kind a man takes when he realizes that the most important moment of his life is happening on a porch in a town he's never been to, and the only thing standing between him and everything he lost is the difference between 2 interpretations of the same sentence. He looked at Nico. The boy had finished his toast and was watching them both with the quiet, observant attention of a child who doesn't understand the words but reads the weather between adults with perfect accuracy. Then Brennan looked back at Maren, and when he spoke, his voice carried something it had never carried before. Not just honesty, which he'd always had, but clarity. The precision of a man who had finally learned that the most important sentences of his life could not afford to be misread. "I said I didn't have an answer I trusted. That didn't mean no." He paused. Not for effect, for accuracy. It meant I was terrified. It meant I had watched my father treat fatherhood like a prison, and I was scared to death that the same thing lived inside me. And when I said those words to you that night, Maren, I wasn't closing a door. I was opening one. I was standing in front of the most frightening question of my life, and I was asking you to help me figure out the answer. I was asking you to stay. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 3 years of conversations that never happened, full of every word that should have been spoken and wasn't by him, because he didn't know how to make his honesty sound like an invitation instead of a conclusion, by her, because she had been trained since childhood to hear the verdict underneath the sentence and act on it before the gavel fell. Every assumption she had made, every translation, every interpretation, every silent conviction that she knew what he meant better than he did, hung in the air between them like evidence in a trial neither of them had agreed to. "You could have said that," Maren whispered. Her voice had lost its rehearsed steadiness. What was left was raw, unfinished, stripped of the composure she'd spent 3 years building like armor. "You could have asked," Brennan said. Not cruel, not accusatory, just true. The kind of true that doesn't wound because it's aimed at you. It wounds because it's aimed at the exact place where your own story has a hole you've been walking around for years. Maren opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. In every rehearsal, she'd had an answer for everything. She'd had a rebuttal for every challenge, a justification for every choice, a wall for every door he might try to open. She had no answer for this, because Brennan wasn't attacking her decision. He wasn't telling her she was wrong. He was telling her something worse, something her rehearsals had never accounted for. He was telling her she'd never had all the information, and she'd built a life, a beautiful, functional, carefully constructed life, on an incomplete translation. Nico squirmed on her hip. He pointed at Brennan with one small finger and looked at his mother with an expression that was pure, uncomplicated curiosity. "Mama," he said. "Who's that?" Maren looked at her son. She looked at Brennan. She looked at the space between them, 3 feet of porch, 3 years of silence, a lifetime of learning to read what people meant by what they didn't say. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't translate. She just stood there, holding her son, holding the truth, letting both of them be heavy. "Now listen to me. Don't go anywhere. Don't switch to another video. Don't scroll past this moment, because everything you've heard, his side, her side, every assumption, every wound, every choice that felt right at the time, all of it collides in what comes next. And I promise you, it's going to land differently than you think. Stay locked in, because this is where the real lesson lives." She let him in. Not into the house, not yet. But she stepped aside from the doorway and nodded toward the porch, and Brennan understood the geography of what she was offering. Outside, not inside. Close, not committed. A space that belonged to neither of them. Neutral ground where two people who had loved each other into wreckage could sit and decide whether anything was left worth salvaging. She set Nico down. The boy looked at Brennan one more time with those serious gray eyes, then spotted a butterfly near the edge of the yard and took off after it, with the single-minded joy of a child who has not yet learned that most beautiful things don't let you catch them. Maren sat on the top step. Brennan sat on the opposite end, close enough to touch if either of them reached, but neither of them reached. Not yet. The distance between them was deliberate, measured, fragile, the kind of space two people maintain when they know that closing it will change everything, and they're not sure they're ready for what everything looks like. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They watched Nico chase the butterfly across the grass, and the silence between them was different from any silence they'd shared before. It wasn't comfortable, the way it used to be on the couch with a documentary playing. It wasn't the hollow silence of absence, the kind Brennan had lived inside for 3 years. It was loaded, pressurized, the silence of two people standing at the edge of a conversation they both knew would either rebuild something or finish it for good. Brennan spoke first, not because he was ready, but because he had learned, the hard way, over 3 years of holding words inside until they calcified, that waiting for readiness is just another word for hiding. "I kept your mug," he said. Maren turned to look at him. "What?" "The one from the flea market, the blue one with the chip on the handle. You left it in the dish rack." He stared at the yard, not at her. "I kept it there. 3 years, same spot. I couldn't move it because moving it meant you were really gone and I couldn't." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I kept paying your phone plan too. $47 a month, every month, just in case you turned it back on, just in case one day I called that number and heard something other than silence." Maren's hands pressed flat against her knees. Her fingers were rigid, white-knuckled, holding onto her own body like it was the only solid thing left. "Brennan." "I wasn't moving on," he said. "Everyone told me to. My mother, Dominic, a woman I tried to take to dinner who told me I wasn't in the room. And she was right, I wasn't. I was standing in the doorway of that apartment trying to figure out what I did. Every single day for 3 years, I woke up trying to solve a crime I didn't know I'd committed. And the answer was here, 600 miles away, behind a blue door, growing up without me." His voice didn't break. It bent, the way steel bends under enough pressure, holding its shape but showing the strain in every syllable. Maren didn't defend herself. She didn't reach for the rehearsed explanations or the carefully constructed logic that had carried her through 1,000 sleepless nights. She owed him the truth, and the truth did not come with a frame around it. "I painted the nursery green," she said. Her voice was quieter than his, not smaller, just closer to the ground, the way you speak when the words cost something. "The exact green of that jacket you wore, the one with the frayed cuffs. I didn't even realize I'd chosen it until the second coat was on the wall and I stood back and felt you standing in the room. I had to repaint it the same week because I couldn't fall asleep inside the color of you." Brennan closed his eyes. Briefly, the kind of blink that lasts a half second longer than it should and tells you everything about what's happening underneath. When Nico was born, she continued, he opened his eyes and they were yours, your exact shade of gray. And I cried, not because I was sad, but because I realized I was going to spend the rest of my life looking at a face that would remind me of the choice I made every single day. She paused. I told myself I was protecting him from a father who didn't want to be one, protecting him from growing up watching a man resent the life he'd been handed. Maren, I thought I was being brave. I know. I thought I was doing what your father should have done, leaving before the staying turned into something that poisoned everyone in the house. Brennan opened his eyes. He looked at her, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with something more honest than either. You were protecting yourself, he said. From finding out, I might have said yes. The sentence landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the impact spread outward, through her ribs, through her throat, through every justification she had stacked like bricks around a decision she had never once allowed herself to question from the outside. Because he was right. Not entirely. The fear for Nico was real. The memory of Gerald's dead-eyed presence at the dinner table was real. The lessons her mother had taught her about love as something you endure rather than enjoy were real. But underneath all of it, beneath every rational, defensible, carefully constructed reason, there was a simpler truth she had never spoken aloud. She was afraid that Brennan would have chosen them, and that the choosing would have been genuine, and that she would have had to live inside a love she couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't translate into certainty, and that terrified her more than leaving ever did. I don't know how to let you in, she said, without taking apart everything I've built. Brennan looked at the yard. Nico had abandoned the butterfly and was now crouching near the fence, examining something in the grass with the focused intensity of a scientist who has just discovered a new species. Then don't take it apart, Brennan said. Just unlock the door. Maren exhaled. It was the first full breath she'd taken since she opened the front door and saw him standing there. The first breath that went all the way down past the walls, past the rehearsals, past 3 years of holding everything in place with nothing but discipline and the daily repetition of a story she needed to believe. Nico stood up from whatever he'd been studying near the fence and came running across the yard toward the porch. He was holding something in his fist, a dandelion, pulled from the edge of the lawn, its stem bent and its head already beginning to shed. He charged up the steps with the unsteady determination of a 3-year-old who has decided something is urgent, stopped directly in front of Brennan, and held the weed out to him. For you, Nico said. The words were simple. The offering was ordinary, a weed, a common thing that grows in every yard and gets pulled out by anyone who cares about appearances. But Brennan took it from his son's small hand with both of his own, and he held that dandelion the way a man holds something sacred, carefully, with his full attention, with the reverence of someone who understands that the most valuable things in life are the ones you didn't earn and don't deserve and can't believe you've been given. His hands were shaking. His jaw was tight. His eyes were full of everything he had spent a lifetime keeping behind walls and under control and locked inside the quiet, careful architecture of a man who loved like he was defusing a bomb. The bomb went off, not in destruction, in release. His face crumpled, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, the way a structure comes down when the last supporting beam gives way, not in violence, but in surrender. Tears ran down his face and he didn't wipe them. He just sat on that porch step holding a bent dandelion and looking at a boy who had his eyes in his jawline and no idea at all, that he had just handed his father the first gift he'd ever received from his own child. Thank you, Brennan said. His voice was thick and rough and stripped of every defense he'd ever built. Thank you, buddy. You're welcome, Nico said with a shrug, already turning, already running back to the yard, already chasing the next thing the way only children can. Completely present, completely unattached to the moment they just created, completely unaware that they've changed the landscape of someone else's entire life. Maren watched it all. She watched this man, this careful, terrified, honest man who had never known how to say what he felt, come completely undone over a dandelion handed to him by a boy who didn't know his name. And something inside her that had been locked for 3 years, something older than the decision, older than the fear, older than the translation she'd built her whole identity around, turned. Not opened, not yet, but turned, the way a key turns before the door swings wide. She reached across the space between them, those 18 inches of porch that held 3 years of silence, and placed her hand on top of his, the one holding the dandelion. Her palm was warm, his was trembling, and when he turned his hand over without hesitation, lacing his fingers through hers with a grip that said everything his words had struggled to carry for as long as he'd been alive, Maren didn't translate it. She didn't need to. Some things don't require translation. Some things arrive in a language so plain, so physical, so completely without subtext that even a woman who had spent her entire life reading between the lines could finally, mercifully, just read the line itself. They sat there, fingers laced, the dandelion held between their joined hands, already wilting, already imperfect, already shedding its seeds into the afternoon air. Nico played in the yard. The sun moved across the sky, and the silence between them changed languages, not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way a tide changes, slowly and then all at once, from absence to presence, from question to answer, from two separate maps drawn by two separate hands to one shared territory they would have to chart together, slowly, with no guarantee of getting it right. But they would get it honest. And honest, both of them were finally beginning to understand, is where every real thing begins. Every story has a lesson. This one has two. Because this story was never about one person being right. It was about two people being incomplete. His moral loving someone carefully is not the same as loving them clearly. Brennan Holt gave Maren the most honest thing he had, and it wasn't enough because honesty without clarity is a locked door with the key still in your pocket. If the people who matter most have to, guess what you mean? Your silence isn't strength. It's a quieter form of hiding. And the people you love will fill that silence with whatever story their own wounds need to believe. Her moral, deciding what someone would choose before they've had the chance to choose it, is not protection. It's control dressed in softer clothes. Maren Collier loved Brennan enough to leave him, but she never loved him enough to stay and be wrong. She translated his fear into a verdict and delivered the sentence without ever letting him take the stand. And the life she built to protect her son became the very thing that wounded him. The deeper truth, the most dangerous stories we tell, are not lies. They are the incomplete truths we build entire lives around, because finishing the conversation felt more terrifying than walking away from it. Love does not ask you to be fearless. It asks you to be afraid and stay in the room anyway. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the conversations you've left unfinished, the things you translated instead of asking, the people you protected from a choice you were afraid they'd actually make, then subscribe and hit that bell. Because every story on this channel is built to show you both sides of a wound and let you decide which one needs healing first. I'll see you in the next one.